Hello, online class of 3302. I wanted to share something with you guys that came up in my face-to-face class the other day that we talked about, and I thought that I wanted to bring it to you guys too, to sort of share and think through with you. I think it's an important issue for us to think about. So we started off by reading this. It's like a letter to the editor. Just you to listen. I want you to think about what I'm saying. So here's this message. The relative decline of American education at the elementary and high school levels has long been a national embarrassment, as well as a threat to the nation's future. Teachers, most of whom have few skills and no work ethic, are to blame. Much of the ability to teach is innate, an ability to inspire young minds, as well as control unruly classrooms that some people instinctively possess, and some people definitely do not. Although many teachers may like children, we can agree that teaching in public schools has not always attracted the best and the brightest. Some studies suggest most school teachers are recruited from the bottom third of college-bound high school students. Measuring teacher performance based in part on the test scores of their pupils would seem to be a no-brainer to get rid of these dim folks who couldn't succeed in any other career. So just think about that. Here's what I just read. If you need a little visual. Curious, I wish I could be talking with you right now. I'm curious to know what your reactions are to that, what it makes you feel, what, if you agree, if you disagree, if you have proof, either research or life experience, that counters some of those claims, right? Maybe you weren't in the bottom third of your high school class. Maybe you feel like you have learned how to teach better, that it isn't just innate, that there is a learned component to it as well, that you do work hard, that you do have a work ethic. I think you would probably all agree, especially, not only, but especially the WPE folks, right, who are balancing families and careers at the same time as this, right? So just think about how that feels. In my face-to-face class, after I read that, we had a really long discussion. Really long. People were talking about economic indicators, right? So what schools are responsible for and what schools can't be responsible for. They talked about life experiences. They drew on texts that we had read. They were synthesizing across multiple sources. They were angry, right? They were sharing some of their reactions. We talked, probably the most people talked that had talked in any conversation yet this semester. And we talked a long time. It was a really effective discussion that brought up a lot of interesting points. Some people said they kind of agreed. They could understand where the person was coming from, but... And then I asked my class, and this is what I really want you to think about. I asked my class, you know, you guys are readers. You can read this. What if instead of that discussion, I had said, make free text-to-self connections. That's what good readers do. Right? What if I hadn't said, tell me how this makes you angry. Tell me if you agree or not. Tell me the various perspectives you have on this. Tell me the information that might be left out of something like this. Tell me all the other things you might be thinking about. If I had only said, connect. Think of all that would have been lost. So this isn't an actual letter. I compiled this from various sources, right? I've pulled together. All of this stuff is stuff that gets said, right? I crafted this together. Because I have a feeling that you disconnected from this piece, right? I have a feeling that making a text-to-self connection, like good readers do, was probably not the best way to tap into what you were thinking about something like this. Does that feel right? I want you to live that, because that's the kind of experience that Stephanie Jones and her co-authors are talking about in the Reading Turnaround when they talk about the power of disconnections, right, in Chapter 5. Then you're reading about that in Module 3. So some students had questions about that, so I'm making this now to sort of fill in a little bit. You read in chapter 5 of Reading Turnaround about how Cadence was just making these very surface connections, in fact, making them up, right? So she was saying, you know, she would read a story about a birthday party and there was a goldfish. And so she said, well, I had a goldfish at my birthday party, right? And they're, oh, text-to-self connection. You're a good reader, Cadence, yay. And luckily, Stephanie Jones, who was her teacher, had been at her birthday party and said, no, you didn't. There were other things at your birthday party, but there actually wasn't a goldfish. In fact, Cadence's family and Cadence's community and Cadence's birthday parties all looked very different than a lot of the storybooks that were in her classroom that she could connect to, right? And so what Stephanie realized in that moment is that, first of all, a couple of things. She was actually encouraging, because she was only encouraging connections, some students were making them up, and some students were having them be very surface. Because the point isn't whether or not you have a goldfish at your birthday party, right? That's not why we make text-to-self connections. We make text-to-self connections to understand how it is that what we have lived through is influencing our comprehension of the text. Does that make sense? So it's not just about, oh, good. Like, it's not about taking an inventory of who has a goldfish. Like, that does not matter. The point is, once you connect that, how does it influence your understanding of the story? That's the so what of connections that really matters. And it doesn't mean that we have to have students articulate the so what every time they make a connection, but you might want to ask them to do that sometimes. And we as teachers certainly need to understand that that's what we're pushing for. We are pushing for connections, not just to say, oh, you did it, and like now you get a cookie, right? That's not the point. The point is instead to say, okay, you can connect with that. What does that mean now for what you understand? How does that influence your comprehension? Okay, does that make sense? That's the key. So when they're saying you use disconnections, there's a couple things. First of all, you can tap into a much larger pool of experiences and reactions and information that you're allowing students to also draw on to influence their comprehension of the text. It doesn't have to be the same in order to use it. Does that make sense? So think about it this way. In some ways, disconnections are actually deeper thinking than connections are. So let me explain. If you make a connection with the text, then you're saying, like, this is me, and this is what I'm reading, and they're the same, right? I have a goldfish, there's a goldfish in the book. That's easy, right? It's like a one-to-one correspondence. It's not that deep. Does that make sense? If you're able to make a disconnection, what you're actually doing is you're saying, this is me, this is what I read, there's a gap. It's not automatic. There's a gap, and now I have to be able to explain that gap. There's an extra step that's actually in some ways deeper thinking. Isn't that cool? So that's one reason that's really important to tap into to disconnections, because you're actually encouraging kids to do more thinking. So let me see if I can explain it one other way. When I was teaching in DC, I had my kids write in journals, right? And every day we wrote in journals, and it was like a free write, and sometimes it was creative thinking, and sometimes it was arts-based and whatever. But we did a lot of journal writing. And I remember this one child, Germani, he was mad one day. It was like after lunch, he'd had a fight on the playground or something, and he was mad. And he said, I don't want to write in my journal. And I was like, oh, well, come talk to me about it. So he brought his journal up. I don't want to do it. Ms. Ryan, I don't want to do it. I don't want to write in my journal. I said, okay. Are there other things you'd rather do than write in your journal? Yes. Like what? Like anything, like talk to my friends, like be on the playground, like right, listed all this stuff. I was like, well, that's a lot of stuff. And I was like, yeah. I was like, why don't you write me a list in your journal of all the things you'd rather do than write in your journal? And he was like, oh, yeah, I can do that. There's a lot of things I'd rather do. Great. Go ahead and sit down and write in your journal about that. And he did, right? Because the point isn't actually, do you want to write in your journal or not? The point is writing in your journal, right? And Germani went and wrote in his journal. I don't really care if it was about all the things he'd rather be doing, because you know what? He wasn't doing those other things. He was writing in his journal. Does that make sense? Maybe I'm like a horrible, tricky, bad teacher, but that really happened. So I think of disconnections in that kind of way. I don't care if you have a goldfish or not. I care that you're thinking about your experience in relation to the text and able to analyze that difference. That's the thinking, because that's what's going to influence your comprehension. Now, you might understand something different about the story than someone who does have a goldfish at their birthday party, right? And we can think of better examples, right? If you're reading a book where they're about like a child's relationship with his mother, then like if you have a mother in your life versus if you don't have a mother in your life, that might influence like your depth of understanding of the story, what the character is feeling, what the character is going through, right, whatever. But either way, we can use both of those experiences to think about that book. It doesn't have to be the same. What you understand might be different, but you can still do the thinking about your life in relation to the character. Does that make sense? And so our job as teachers, I think, is to figure out which of those connections and disconnections are more significant and how do we help our students think through them. But no matter what, how do we make space for a variety of those kinds of experiences? Because that's what Stephanie started to find, right? She started to find that a lot of the things that she was asking Cadence to be able to connect to weren't really in her world. And so instead of having some kids able to connect sometimes and disconnect sometimes, there was like kids who could connect and kids who couldn't. And that's what forced that sort of either surface connections, like, well, I've had shoes that were brown, and like maybe that's not the point, or fake connections. Oh yeah, that's like me, but it's not. And so when is it okay for Cadence to say, that's actually not like me? I'm actually like these other things. And that experience, even though it's different than most of you, lets me understand this other perspective. Right? How do you draw on all that kids are, all that they are, all that their communities are? Remember, we've been talking about identity, reader identities in here. This is that kind of thing, right? How do you say you and your community matter, even if they don't look exactly like what's in the book? And how can you still draw on those experiences and draw on what some researchers call those funds of knowledge, right? Who you are, what you've lived, to understand the text in front of you, whether or not it matches your life. And then how can we expand the books in our libraries to make sure that all kids get some chances to match and some chances to say, oh, that's different, I never knew that. And we'll talk about that a lot more in Module 4, right? We'll talk about how, this is your little teaser, we'll talk about how texts can be windows and mirrors. So think about what it might mean for a book to be a window or a book to be a mirror, okay? And then we'll talk about how all kids deserve both, okay? We don't want some kids who get windows and some kids who get mirrors. We want all kids to have both experiences. It's kind of like saying we don't want some kids to connect to books and some kids to disconnect. We want all kids to have both of those experiences because there's a sophistication of thinking about what it is that they read that's really valuable, okay? So that's the sort of nitty-gritty on disconnections. I know a couple of you had questions about that. I hope this starts to help. I think we've done, most of what we've done in my online class. And like I said, we'll come back to some of this in Module 4, but I hope at least this is a start. So thank you to the people who asked the questions, and I hope this has helped a little bit. If not, you know my email, write to me, and we'll talk about it more. Thanks, guys.